I'm gonna start with Ryan, if that's okay. Because Ryan, in preparation for this conference, I've noticed from quite a few of my Canadian correspondents that you must be quite an important guy for all the regulations right now for UAS in Canada. And I think many are very excited what you have to tell us. So what are you working on right now?
Just sound check. Can I confirm that everyone can hear me, both in Canada and Germany?
It's
Yes?
okay.
Okay, great. I'll start by being humble and saying it's not really one person that drives any regulatory file. I'm just the face of a broad network of people, both within the government of Canada and the Canadian industry, that are helping us collaboratively inform how the regulations are developed so that we can achieve our mutual objectives of safety and ultimately economic growth. So I'll start with that humble statement. In terms of the work that we're doing, a lot of fascinating work at Transport Canada. Some of you in the Canadian context may know that in our recent federal government budget in 2017, that there was some investment made in advancing work in the connected and automated vehicle environment, as well as the UAS or UAV environment. So, we're happy to have received some additional resources to focus our efforts on these technologies. On the UAS side, we are in the process of standing up a team at Transport Canada that's going to focus exclusively on UAS-related policy, regulatory, and technology issues. So we're pretty excited about that. It's taken up quite a bit of our collective efforts over the first half to two-thirds of 2017. But I think it's going to well position us for the future in terms of how we progressively move forward with BWAS, which has been underway for some time, and then moving into the next frontiers of beyond visual line of sight, AI, and some of the applications that our colleagues from Airbus had demonstrated earlier today. So that's really what we're doing at a large macro level. In terms of some of the specifics around the regulatory work that they're doing, there was kind of 3 points that I wanted to touch upon today and leave with the audience. Maybe that'll stimulate some discussion after. I'm going to refer to a couple notes, not to pick on Alex's introduction earlier, but the notes help me be focused to respect my 5 minutes, and it keeps me away from being too nerdy in the deep dive of intricacies in the discussion of this technology. So I'll refer to them from time to time. I think Mark, in his last presentation, adequately addressed the tremendous opportunity and growth that exists here in Canada in terms of the technology use and end users. From a Transport Canada perspective, Mark had showed the slide of the growth that has occurred since 2010 to where we are today, and it's been anything but incremental. It's been quite sizable. I think back to 2010, where we issued approximately 66 special flight operation certificates in a year, to last year, where we issued over 4,300. And early projections for 2017 are somewhere to the 6,000 or 7,000 range. So that shows you the volume of commercial operations that are taking place in the Canadian context. So what is this telling us? I think it's telling us that there's great potential for UAS deployment in Canada, and there's a number of reasons for that. I think our geography and our environment leads to the beneficial use of this technology in the dull, dirty, and dangerous types of tasks. I think our infrastructure, utility sector, natural resources, tremendous opportunity for this technology to be used. Highly educated society that's been supported by the establishment of clusters focused on technology and aerospace, although noting some of the remarks that Mark had made. I think all of these things together are creating the right type of environment for this technology to really take off in Canada. So what does that mean for us as Transport Canada, as the aviation authority? Well, it means many things. I think the first is we have to look at the world differently in terms of how we establish policy and how we regulate in this space, and how do we keep pace with technological advancements where use cases are changing every day to every week, new technology-based solutions are coming out. How do you regulate in that environment? And so it's a challenge, but one thing that I like about Transport Canada here in Canada, which is a little bit different than our other aviation authorities around the world, is that we are not a standalone aviation administration or aviation authority. Transport Canada portfolio.
We lost the mic. We lost the mic. I'm sorry. Could you hold the mic closer to you? We don't hear you anymore.
Hello? Yeah. Sorry about that.
Continue. Ryan, at the moment we don't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Not, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm somewhere caught between a Verizon commercial and the tech equivalent to a flyaway. We're back on, I think. So that's positive. So I was just highlighting about how Transport Canada is a little different than other aviation administrations. And I think that's a real strong suit in Canada. And the reason why I say that is our department as a whole focuses on 3 to 4 key policy issues and policy considerations. And that's around innovation and economic growth. It's about environmental sustainability, and it's about safety and security. And even though I rest and our team rests in the aviation group, we're challenged to think about how our policies and our regulations influence all of those strategic objectives. And in fact, even our legislation in the Aeronautics Act speaks to the dual role that we play and how we promote aeronautics in the aeronautics industry, which we now believe encompasses UAS, but how do we juxtapose that against balancing it with achieving our safety objectives? And we have to not lose sight of those two competing and sometimes complementary objectives as we move forward. So that's something that we're really, at times grappling with, but at times don't want to lose sight of because it's extremely important in providing support to the sector as we move forward. I think another important point in the Canadian context, and I don't want to say too much from my colleague Brian here, but Transport Canada doesn't provide air traffic services. That's the responsibility of NAV Canada. So it adds a bit of a different dynamic in the Canadian context, which I know Brian will speak to a little bit. But what I would like to highlight is the importance of the positive contribution of relationship that we have together, particularly when you look at UAS technology. As one of the previous speakers said, it's really a system of systems. And UAS and integration and traffic management is part of that system of systems. So those are some of the considerations that I'd like to highlight from a Transport Canada perspective. Moving to maybe an issue that would be of interest to some of you here today is an important milestone was hit for us this year. In the summer, July, we published our proposed rules for visual line of sight operations, 25 kilograms and less. We had a 90-day consultation period that actually ended in October, and we did some national engagement sessions across the country. I won't go into the details, as we often say during our presentations. It's a body of law that's about 59 pages long, and I think I have about 5 minutes, and I probably used about 4 of it already. So what I would like to just highlight in the context of the proposed rules is that we're taking a risk-based approach. The framework considers the weight of the UAV, where it's operated, and the complexity of the operations. In short, the more complex the operation, the more rigor the regulatory requirements are. Those are kind of the pillars of that. We're focusing on 3 particular areas in our body of law. We think they're the most influential in trying to achieve our broader safety objectives. One is the pilot. Having pilots that are knowledgeable and understand the rules of the air and the risks that are associated with their respective operations. And in some cases, under complex environments, we're proposing that pilots have permits and undergo written knowledge exams and undertake flight attestations. We think pilot knowledge and experience is probably one of the most fundamental aspects of safe operations and integration. The second area is the UAS as a system. We think that there should be a certain degree of reliability in these products as they're used. So we've got some provisions that speak to that. And then lastly, it focuses a lot, the meat of the proposed rules, on operational procedures. So how can this technology be deployed safely? What are the operational considerations that need to be in place? How does communication take place with our air traffic service provider if one's operating in controlled airspace? So there's a lot of focus on the operational procedural elements of flight operations. So those are kind of the 3 pillars of our proposed rules. As I mentioned earlier, we did a 90-day consultation period. It ended on October 13th. We received over 650 written submissions from a broad spectrum of users across the country. Our team is currently looking at those comments that we've received and seeing whether changes are required. There's definitely some well thought out proposals that have been brought forward for consideration. In terms of next steps, our goal is really to look at finalizing these rules in 2018. And we think 2018 is going to be an exciting year for us and for the industry as well. If we can publish the visual line of sight rules, we can turn our greater attention to beyond visual line of sight. And I know Mark touched upon that in his previous discussion. I know there's a number of you out there that are probably keenly interested to move operations into that environment. So my closing remarks really from a regulatory perspective are innovations driving regulation. And as regulators, we know it isn't the reverse. Our ability to provide a regulatory framework will enable the mainstream use of this technology. And the key that we have to focus on is smart regulations. We know that as a regulatory body, it's very difficult to keep the regulatory framework up to speed with the rapidly changing technology. So how do we develop regulations that are smart, will withstand the test of time? How do we find the right balance between having prescriptive requirements and performance-based requirements where we set safety objectives and we let industry innovate and identify the means to achieve those safety objectives as ends? So that's really the balance that we're striking for from a regulatory perspective. We believe that an appropriately balanced regulatory framework will provide the regulatory predictability for many people to invest in this technology and to deploy it in a safe way. And we hope that that will enable companies to start up, grow, and continue to innovate and ultimately be economically successful in doing so. And that we think that the mainstream use of UAVs, supported by the system of systems, as referred to earlier, will demonstrate reliability and the benefits of the technology, which together will lead to social acceptance and economic growth. So that's really how we're looking at this from a strategic perspective at the department. So thank you very much. I've probably gone over my time, but thank you for your generosity.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I was a little bit patient about timing because you had all the commercial breaks and the late start, but I'm going to be a little bit more strict with my next speakers. I'm sorry about that, but we want to get through today. And our next speaker is Raimund, because he is somehow your German counterpart at the Federal Ministry of Transportation and Digital Infrastructure. And like Mark, you are working at the ministry on somehow meeting the expectations of the industry for innovation, but at the same time, you have the public and politicians calling for regulation of that market. So where are you right now, and what is the future of this industry sector?
Thank you, Alex, and happy to be here, and thanks to the GCC for the invitation. Can everybody hear me? Looks like it.
The podium in Canada not, yes. Okay, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So in a way, you already anticipated my intro, because to answer the question, what are we working on right now, I would say, since we have amended our aviation legislation, and we have recently published our so-called joint principles on the approval of UAV operations, one of our main tasks right now is actually to answer questions by the public, by members of parliament, and these questions can be probably divided into two major groups. One group complains that UAV regulations in Germany are still rather restrictive and still put a burden on the growing industry. And the other group more represents people who complain that the government still allows these kind of creepy vehicles to be up there to do strange things, and nobody has an eye on that. So, and that's actually the dilemma we are in. I think most other countries, or states, I should say, are in this dilemma as well. And we tried to manage it, as I said, by amending our regulation. That happened just to full effect this October. So we still are in the initial phase, the phase of infancy, so to say, and let's see how things are developing. But our aim was to improve the situation for commercial operations, or to say for operations that are not only for leisure purposes, and at the same time to make life for the leisure operators a little bit more difficult. So what we started, or how we started, was to get rid of the old difference we had in Germany, which put leisure operators in some kind of beneficial situation, because up to takeoff weight of 5 kilo, they did not need governmental authorization here in Germany. Commercial operators used to always have to obtain an authorization, which from a risk-based perspective was not fair, because of course leisure operated UAV can cause as much damage as commercially operated. There's no reason to differentiate here. So that's what we got rid of. And now commercial operators up to 5 kilos do not need an authorization either. But of course, we have to be aware that safety, security, privacy, and also the environment is not compromised. So we have a catalogue of, let's say, particularly risky operations that always needs a governmental approval. For example, beyond visual and line of sight operations are regarded as these kind of risky operations, and they always need a governmental authorization, even if the weight is less than 5 kilo. At the same time, we have also introduced some limitations to all drone operations which haven't been there before. One is the requirement that everybody who pilots an UAV with a weight of more than 2 kilo needs, well, we don't call it a license, but it's actually a license. So some kind of, probably qualification would be the better term here, which he can obtain with qualified entities, which are approved by the German CAA. Furthermore, we have introduced the requirement to earmark the UAV. And then we have introduced a maximum altitude to operate to 100 meters. If you want to operate higher than 100 meters, you always need a governmental authorization. And that also brings me to another point, which is important when you talk about UAV in Germany, is that because this created a lot of problems when we introduced the safety-based 100-meter maximum altitude, was that we have a huge tradition of flying models in Germany. They are doing this hobby, they call it a sport, other people call it a hobby, since decades, and there are estimated around 300, 400,000 people doing this in Germany, so they have a voice. And they were strictly opposing a limitation to 100 meters for their kind of flying models. At the same time, there were pilots out there, in particular helicopter pilots, but also the general public who said, no, that is not acceptable, that these can fly, these vehicles can fly as high as they want. So that was something which prolonged the preparation of our new legislation quite significantly. In Germany, the federal states are in charge to grant authorization. And that's, well, I'm happy I don't have to explain to Canadians what federalism actually is. But for us, it causes a little bit of a situation because we don't want to have a huge differences in the execution of the discretionary powers they have. So we would like a rather harmonized approach among all of Germany. So what we did in the Ministry of Transport, we have published so-called joint principles of UAV authorizations, which should, well, help, on one hand, the authorities of the federal states to make a sound decision, but at the same time to help the community, the commercial drone operators, for example, to tell them what they should provide, what kind of information they should bring to the authority, which allows the one more minute, if I may, which allows the authority to make that decision. And in case the operation is difficult to authorize, then they probably can already know what kind of mitigation measures they can introduce to make an operation which probably is not permissible, actually turn it into a permissible one. A lot of people asked us why we have not mentioned for example, e-registration or e-identification or geofencing or, let's say, more sophisticated technical elements to our regulation. The background of this is that, most people of you know, that European legislation is on its way. The draft has been finalized. And all this, what I'm mentioning here, in particular the introduction of unmanned traffic system, in the European management system. In the European context, you call it U-Space. That will be definitely subject of the European legislation. The only problem is that for the time being, the European bodies, in particular the EASA, is not yet in power to do this because we need to change the basic regulation, which is also happening right now, but the process is much more difficult than people expected, and we might see another year until that has been changed, and then probably another 1 year until we have the European legislation on UAV, and then probably another year until this all enters into force. So that's the situation right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Raymond. And so, if I counted correctly, 2020, we will have a regulation. Yeah? All right. Before we go to visions and how we actually work right now with UAVs, I would like to turn back to Montreal and to Brian. Hallo Brian, wie geht es dir? Brian, could you move to the pulse, please? It will work? I think we hear you better when you stand there.
Vielleicht this is better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alex.
And please stick to
thank
be
you for this
a German timekeeper, okay? I'm sorry about that.
No, I'll keep it short and sweet. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm pleased to provide an air navigation service provider perspective. For those who are not aware, NavCAD is the, as far as I know, the only completely private air navigation service provider in the world. We are not associated with the Government of Canada or with Transport Canada. We provide air traffic services for the entire country, as well as half the Atlantic Ocean for the transatlantic traffic, which is significant, some 1,200 aircraft a day across between Europe and North America. And we're also responsible for maintaining the air navigation system. So all your air navigation aids, all that surveillance capability and so on is provided by Nav Canada. And we're very proud to say that through a company called Arion, we are now 50% complete of our constellation for space-based ADS-B surveillance, which will increase the surveillance of aircraft from what now is limited to 20% of the surface of the world to 100% when the system is operational next year. So we're very proud of that. And surveillance is very important when it comes to air traffic control and air traffic management. I hope that system will be able to assist in advancing the surveillance of remotely piloted aircraft systems as well. So, where are we in Canada with respect to supporting unmanned aircraft systems? We like to call it segregated integration. The regulations currently support commercial operations that must remain within visual line of sight of the operator, and so there's very limited service we can provide to them, other than the fact that we have to approve any operations that will occur within controlled airspace. Controlled airspace is the mandate of the air navigation service provider. Uncontrolled airspace is still regulated by Transport Canada, and but our services are in the controlled airspace only. So whenever we look at an operation or a change in support of this or provision of service, we look at it from a risk analysis perspective, and we provide our service and incorporate procedures to make sure that the operation is safe. Flight safety is paramount to us, and I can appreciate the regulators' dilemma in trying to support an industry that has all sorts of economic potential and the creation of jobs and the responding to a lobby that wants to advance unmanned aircraft systems, but at the same time the regulator is responsible for flight safety, not only of the participants in the aviation industry, but also the safety of people and property on the ground. So it's a very difficult position to be in, and we collaborate with Transport Canada in all regulatory development from a domestic perspective. And NAV Canada also participates at the international level with ICAO within the RPAS panel to develop the standards and recommended practices for operations within international airspace. What are the big risks that we've found in our exposure, limited exposure right now to visual line of sight operations? I think the big issue right now is education and training. We're dealing with a population of UAS operators that don't necessarily have an aviation background, and they're not aware of airspace rules and airspace structure and where they can and cannot operate, and that is critical to a safe operation. So that is a big point that we're trying to work with Transport Canada and with the UAS industry to advance that awareness of the rules. Situational awareness is another big issue. When you operate in airspace, you need to be aware of where you are. You need to be aware of other traffic around you, not only unmanned aircraft systems, but also manned aircraft as well. So these are critical things. And as far as technology is concerned, we're collaborating with companies that are advancing some applications to increase that awareness, support education, and provide that information as we go along and eventually evolve into an unmanned aircraft system traffic management system. And where that, who's going to be responsible for the UTM in the future is still up to debate in Canada, but a very interesting topic, and NAV Canada is very interested in exploring that domain as well as we move along. We heard some mention about accountability and how do you ensure that operators operate safely and in accordance with the regulations. We think it's very important to have some means of ensuring this, and the topics of drone registration, drone identification. There are very interesting ideas and concepts that are available right now, that are being advanced, and we're very interested in that as well. And I will finish off with that. We're very excited with this new technology and look forward to further developments and collaboration, both with industry and with the regulator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And we will get back to you. And in the second part of the conference, we will also talk more about the education aspects of the industry, which you just mentioned. But now, after this introduction into what's happening on the regulation side and safety and all of that, we had a first vision from Tristan in your presentation, and we have now in Berlin and Montreal 2 people on the panel who were quite visionary about this business. And I would like to turn out to Frank. Frank is founder and CEO of Drone Masters, and when looking at your website first, I was like, wow, drone races at all major conferences, and that looks like fun. But your mission is actually a very concrete one and a very substantial one for the whole industry and everybody involved in UAVs. So please tell us, and I'm closer to you, so I'm going to look at the 5 minutes. But give us your pitch. Why is the work you do so important for the whole of the industry?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here today. Hello, Canada. What we actually do, as far as I know, we are still the only independent drone incubator on this planet, which means, this is very important, we are not connected to an industry player or corporate. We are really independent and privately funded. That means our mission is really to accelerate this whole drone ecosystem. We started with sports as a means of, by utilizing sports for technical development, because sometimes it really helps to bring a lot of people together in communities like today, like what you had here in Canada, to get faster, better ideas in how to deal with the new technology. And when we started 2 years ago, what we realized that there was basically no cross-sector industry ecosystem. We had the aviation industry, and that's what I really loved about this presentation before, about the Canadian way of looking at unmanned systems, that they are in the air, that they are on the ground and on the sea. And what we built within the last 2 years was one of the largest European networks of experts from automotive industry, aviation industry, IT industry, bringing them together in events with sports, and with tons of meetups, which means we had about 40 meetups within 2 years in 6 countries and 2 continents. And why we are doing this is we are basically connecting industries and startups. We facilitate corporates, we accelerate young companies, and sometimes we invest. For example, we are invested in a logistics spin-off from a major scientific institution within Germany, which are having a flying sensor within the logistics area. And now what we are currently working on, to make it really brief and short, we are deeply convinced that it's all about learning, because currently nobody really knows where it's going to. Probably I'm sitting right beside the new Google. I mean, I truly believe that Airbus is on the right way, and that this will be, this is really smart. And we also will see a lot of small, tiny companies somewhere on the planet with great ideas, and it's all about having an ecosystem where these actors can develop fast. And from our perspective, it's more or less about helping and discussing regulations. That's why we are also deeply into regulations. It's not up to us to go up to regulatory entities and say, make something which makes it happen. It's about making it happen. It's probably comparable to Tesla, which just set up little stations where you could get energy somewhere around, and not asking politicians to set up filling stations for electric vehicles. It's doing things. It's like an entrepreneurial approach. And so we started more or less as a virtual incubator, having all these events and meetups and stuff. And after 1.5 years, we really managed to open up a huge space within Berlin, just 15 minutes from here. We started in 2018 to have a huge sandbox with 36 hectares. It's more or less a co-working space with an airfield. And what we try to do is to connect the developing community in Berlin. Berlin is very, very well known for a strong startup community. And we are convinced that you have to bring the technology to the developers, because the developers won't move. That's why the reason why all major corporations within Germany are moving to Berlin if they are looking for digitization, as they are looking moving to other places in Canada or in Germany if they are looking for other competences. But Berlin is digitization, and that's why we set up a huge space that we can connect these hemispheres, because we hope that we can find some startups earlier than others, and that is our core business. That's basically it.
Thank you very much, Frank. And before we will start up the discussion, I would like to go back to Montreal and to Abdul. We don't see you, but I would also like you to go to the pult. Just because of the microphone, we can hear you better here in Berlin if you speak into that mic, and later you can sit again at the table. So, Abdul, your organization is Humanitas Solutions. That's already a very visionary name. So tell us what you do concrete with UAVs and the Humanitas Solutions.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for all the partners also that we're working with that are here in the room. So Humanitas Solutions started, I'm going to talk about 2 perspectives, from the consumer perspective and also from the solution provider perspective. I'm an emergency physician by training, so it started after Haiti earthquake, where we realized that we needed some kind of tools to be able to communicate better and to have real-time maps, to be able to have an assessment doing surveillance and monitoring from kind of installation. So this was a very important moment where after that, so since 3 years, we're working on this self-deployable, self-configurable system that is fully resilient. This is what we aim to, fully distributed, that works on smaller UAVs, that is able to be deployed in any kind of austere environments. And we had the support of multiple partners for that. Everything should be working on off-the-shelf devices, because now this is where it's going, is a single provider, a solution provider cannot own it all, so it has to be flexible on this. And it has to be also being thought from the first moments of design, the system of a system, so how it was discussed. So, and a lot of the solutions were depending on centralized authorities. So as we saw with the telecommunication issues, if there is anything going on like that, it has to be fully resilient. So what's the fallback mechanism? So this is where we went with academic partners to see what would be the best solutions, and some key industrial partners. And this is one of the points where I wanted to highlight. So we're a startup. We want to stay a startup. It has a lot of energy. It's all about agility and being very innovative in a very dynamic and evolving market. But it needs to be supported by multiple partnerships. And we're lucky to have a multi-million-dollar project going with multiple partners, academic and industrials. And what we're focusing on is we think that there's going to be a lot of AI-driven, the future of this market. So what we're trying to combine is this collaborative robotics, so all the swarming aspects, because we think this is the future. AI, so all that's what can be done in a very, let's say, autonomous way, instead in terms of gathering all the information, analyzing the information, and then providing feedback. You will have some demonstrations today and the field visit. And the last one has to be really something easy to use. So it's all about this capacity to bring information to the end users. And we think that this air traffic management will be done by people in the field. We feel that there should be a mobile unit of air traffic management, because they were having a lot of users having multiple swarms ongoing, and especially in austere environments, and it has to go on their off-the-shelf devices, on their smartphones or tablets, and it has to be working on drones that are manufactured, that are evolving. So technology will be evolved, and we are a software company trying to integrate all this together. So one of the key elements is partnership. Another key element is innovation and speeding up in a very dynamic market. I think there's a lot of things that are going in other countries. We see AI evolving into countries not named just China, about the development of drones, all this manufacturing, and also about the AI that will be provided on the top of those systems. And what we think is that we have here key expertise and also key partners and academic and industrial partners that can combine all efforts to be very well positioned in this market. The thing is that if regulation doesn't follow, if it's not well aligned with the development, we might not be using those solutions, and other countries or other industrial solution providers will take the lead. And one last thing is really making it safe above all. So safety is very important, and we think we're actually working on a project with some partners. We call it the Saturn project. It's for all this certification of autonomous systems. It has to be thought differently. So all this simulation aspects of autonomous systems, there's a lot of research to be done on this, to provide the tools for the evolving 7,000 businesses, small startups coming in Canada. There will be more and more every year. So if they go for this beyond visual line of sight and they want to be autonomous, how to go there? It has to be also automated, so they have access to clear protocols and processes, and this has to be also discussed. Teleoperation, because we have great fields where we can do some testing, but they are a little bit farther than, and this is for a very good reason, from all the urban environments where we do developments. So this is something that has to be also managed. And the other point is it has to be fully unmanned at some point. So it's going to be an autonomous systems trying to bring more information about another autonomous systems that we're trying to test and certify. And risk-based management, that is very important, and neutrality toward the providers, which we think that will be multiple providers of solutions, then it has to fit on multiple drones. So that kind of framework, I think it needs to be put in place pretty soon, so we stay in this dynamic environment in a very strong position. And we think that this market will have a great impact. In our case, we're focusing on disaster response, emergency response, all those austere environments. And we think that this kind of technology will have such an impact in very, very stressful situations, and hoping that with what we're developing, one day we'll be saving much more lives. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Abdul, and a round of applause. And if you see me on my phone, that's because I'm timekeeping from Germany. You know, we're famous for that. I'm looking at the time. We take a little bit of the coffee break to have a little bit of time for discussing among each other. And Christina, please already have a look for questions in Montreal, but I'm going to ask one question to Tristan. Coming home from a conference being titled Airbus, the new Google, that's already quite a success, but what does it entail for you?
Is it working? Yeah. I'll tell that to my boss, and I'm sure I'll have a promotion in that case. Thank you. More seriously, I think that we're on the road. Is the road still long? I think yes. Do we already foresee what is to be reached, meaning the objectives? I think no. But what is sure is that I've heard a lot of words that I know, very technical words like BVLOS or sure, we have to consider operations of UAS behind the visual line of sight. Having this remote control just to have the aircraft flying just near is something which is would be more for leisure, even if some commercial activities for sure, like building inspection are linked to this type of thing, than for big commercial operations. So BVLOS is a must. We speak a lot about autonomy. I think that, and this is an intuition, that we go to autonomy progressively, and that at the beginning it will be more automatic thing than real autonomous assets, and that the ground infrastructures, and we have heard a lot about all these beacons on the ground, and these control stations and air controller will play a role, that's for sure, because flying is something who needs competencies, and I've been flying myself, and I've realized a lot of competencies that I miss sometimes, to do the job. So I think that yes, it's a matter of professional, and if you cannot have people with remote controls flying these objects and being as professional as pilots, because it has a cost, and to be efficient tomorrow, the UAS must be potentially automatic. And to scale up, having the systems flying the objects themselves, controlled by people, supervised by people, and systems on the ground. And this is, I think, where we'll go before having this artificial intelligence being really able to fly the system from A to Z. And this is where we are in between, something that we know is people that are liable of their actions, and the fact that we need this artificial intelligence to run things. And in between, you have Airbus from one side, I would say, and tomorrow might be Airbus like a Google company also. And I hope we go there, and we all work for that, for sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Christina, do you already see first questions in Montreal? We don't hear you. Christina, the mic is off, or we don't hear you.
Hi.
Yes, that's fine.
My question is for Frank. Very interesting concept that you have. Can you talk a bit about what the financial backing is to that in terms of what inspired someone to take this initiative and risk? In other words, who's the champion, if you will, or is it, if not yourself personally?
I rather don't talk about myself as the champion. No, we are now a group of partners who are financially, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm for about 20 years in business. And so whatever we did right now, we are privately funded. And the next steps is that a lot of VCs approaching us, a lot of private funds approaching us, because they are looking for investment possibilities in the area of automated aerial mobility, and we have a deep insight into the market, if that answers your question.
Thank you. And I won't take follow-up questions, but you have in the coffee break a possibility to get into direct dialogue by our matchmaking tools. I have a question over here, Christina. I mentioned your name.
Good to know. Just a 30-second question is, I'm missing the password cybersecurity. Nobody was mentioning it. That's the vision of the future.
Cybersecurity. Who would like to answer to that from the panel, either in Berlin or Montreal? If not, I'm going to advise it. Okay, Raimund, you have your own microphone. It's on.
Oh, it's on. Yeah. Well, cybersecurity is, of course, important because there is always a connection between the station and the unmanned vehicle, and this kind of connection has to be safe. So, for the time being, this has to be part, when we talk about those operations that need a governmental authorization, that has to be part of the assessment of the competent authority to fathom out if cybersecurity aspects are fully met. So, but this has to be always a specific decision in regard to the operation and what kind of areas are overflown, and is there a specific safety risk which might be higher in case of loss of communication, for example. But then this is also something which the security authorities have to look into, probably sometimes in particular with view to the potential of committing crimes with UAV. This falls in the competence of the security authorities, but what we certainly are connected with them.
Looking around, I would have an added question to that for you, Frank, and then a short comment on that by Ryan, because you talk a lot about framing and with every new technical development, there are fears, there are image problems, but especially with UAVs, and people might not have a problem, but if they hear drones, many people have reactions. And I was very astonished that it's the same image in Canada as in Germany. So, and you are working on that. So first of all, where do you have to work on to be changed, and what do you use for that?
Basically, we use sports and entertainment to show the possibilities, because that's the great thing about drones and unmanned systems, that it's more or less, it's Internet of Things, and you can touch it and see it, and you can understand it incredibly fast when it's in front of your eyes. And of course, you have to think about cybersecurity and about all these issues, and you have to look at it from an automotive perspective. And what we try to do, and that was in the beginning when we decided to call it Drone Masters, for at least 1 year, people approached us, you have to call it UAV, UAS, RPAS, whatever, words nobody understands. As a drone, everybody has a picture. When we talk, we had a huge conference on air taxis and manned systems in September, and yes, we talk about manned drones. It's obviously wrong, but everybody understands immediately what is mentioned. And from my perspective, you have to reclaim words. If you, at the spot that you are not using the word drone anymore, or you frame it in the wrong direction, that you think it's always something military, something bad, something evil, a killer, means you have to reframe it, and you have to talk, and you have to shift to a perspective that you see opportunities and chances, and not always just destruction and evil. You have to be aware, and you have to consider it, and we are very, very visible, and we are in contact with all stakeholders, very critical stakeholders, and they accept it because they understand what we are up to, that we are focusing on a commercial sector because there is so incredibly lot of good things to do and such big chances. I mean, we saw so many, we heard so many. That's what we mean by framing. And it's basically, it's entertaining. If we have huge events with up to 100,000 people, and they are excited. We have kids, we have women, we have men, we have, everybody's like, oh wow, that's cool. And that's all about, because then you open up minds and heads, and you foster new development.
Ryan, would you like to comment on that from the Canadian side? Abdo?
Sure. Can you hear me, just to confirm?
Yes, we will hear you in a minute. Yeah, that.
Perfect. I think I'd just like to echo the comments of the other panel members. I think Frank's point right now is spot on, in fact. I think there's a number of ways that we can tackle this issue. I mean, going back to the previous comment around cybersecurity, absolutely concerned, and we see those issues crop up in the traditional aviation environment with Wi-Fi enabled aircraft now, and there's technology in cybersecurity. So we're aware of that.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you, Ryan. Ryan, it's so hard to understand you here. Please move to the pult. It's the language and the sound, and that's too much for our to be able to follow you. Thank you.
Okay, so I was just saying, in short, I'd like to echo most of the comments that have been made already. I think Frank hit it spot on in terms of some ways to increase exposure to a broader network of citizens and communities. To tackle the first question around cybersecurity, I was just highlighting that this is an issue that's emerged with Wi-Fi enabled aircraft as a technology issue that's being looked at by certifying bodies around the world, and we have to look at it in this context and also partner with the security agencies as well in looking at this. But I think it goes back to some of the basic principles that are being looked at in technologies around identification of aircraft or UAS, those that are operating it, what does real-time tracking look like, and then that brings it into a counter-UAS kind of discussion. So there's different ways you can look at addressing the risk of cybersecurity. Some of it can be in the technology itself or how the system comes together. So that's one space, but definitely more work to be done there. In terms of the social acceptance, I think, which is what your question is really trying to get at, I agree with Frank. I think one of the challenges that we face as a sector and as a regulator is that there's a tendency to use the expression in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. So we're not showcasing the positive potential that drone technology brings in a bunch of different use cases. We talk about the incident that occurred, and we showcase that, which further reiterates our collective concern about the use of the technology. So we could do a better job, both as regulators and showcasing in our respective countries the positive use of the technology, and the industry itself could show how this technology is being used and saving lives, or reducing the impacts of forest fires in British Columbia, or getting medical devices to people in time to save their lives, or whatever the use case may be. These are all positive things. So we can showcase them to people. I think through time, we're going to, as a society, become more accepting of the technology and less suspicious of it, but it's not going to happen overnight. So I think framing and exposure is extremely important. And for the operators that are out there, do it safe, exercise due diligence, understand what privacy implications may be out there in the context of using your technology. And I remember back just a couple years ago when Google went out and enhanced its mapping capacity, there was a broad concern about being caught up in Google imagery. They took steps, and now how many of us use that technology every day to figure out what the traffic flow is, what this house looks like because I might move into this neighborhood, and none of us question the privacy implications that we all questioned maybe 5 years ago. So there's an evolution that comes with the technology, and exposure helps alleviate those concerns.
Thank you. And I have a look here. Christina, any questions in Montreal? And after that question, we would go into the coffee break. We don't hear you.
Do you hear me?
Now we hear you.
Okay. It's for shouldn't.
We don't hear your question here on the German side. For the moment, just go to the pult or whoever answers repeats the question. Thank you.
Sure. Hear me with this one?
No, we don't, for the rest of the conference, we don't use the microphones anymore, but the pult. I'm sorry about that, but to speed up time. And
we can share. Go ahead. So my question is, since Mr. Imo was mentioning earlier that most people that are joining or getting into the business of drones or UAVs are not from the aviation industry. One of my worries is I was a flight instructor for a long time, a class 2 chief instructor, chief pilot, etc. My question is, we're going to be training next summer if the Gazette 1 and 2 goes through with the pilot permit. We'll be training the future VLOS pilots. This next summer, if it goes through, maybe the VLOS permit below 25 kilos. If these people are not trained properly, what's going to happen to the VLOS pilot later on? So I guess my question and my answer at the same time, and my comment, is why are we not using FTUs, flight training unit, that exists right now with real flight instructors that are certified by Transport Canada, instead of having people that are starting schools and are not coming from the industry?
It's a very good question. It's one that we've received before. I mean, you know, we encourage the use of FTUs, right? We understand that, but we understand that there's other opportunities for training providers to enter that space, and so we're trying to encourage that as much as possible. I think one of the challenges that we face as the regulator is, yes, we have to put words on paper. The challenge is making sure the road to compliance is easy. And what does that mean? If registration is required, it can't be a paper-based solution. It's got to be e-registration. It's got to be automation. It's got to be easy. If we're going to introduce knowledge exam requirements, it's got to be accessible. It's got to be online. It's got to be available. If those things are not available to people, they will not comply. We have to make compliance as easily as possible. When it comes to the VLOS rules that we have published, there's a space for FTUs to be knowledge providers, trainers in that environment, but there's also opportunity for others in the market to fill that place. As we move forward with the rules coming into place and we begin to collect data around how many operators are out there, what are the safety issues that we're seeing, what are the root causes of the safety issues? Are they the product? Are they human error? Is it the way that people are trained? Have new training providers introduced problems into the overall system? Then we'll need to look at that in the context of compliance and how do we take action to improve it. But I think right now what we're looking at is we're looking to the FTU community and we're looking to others, and we see that as a starting point. As we get into BVLOS, I mean, I think it's fundamentally different. I think VLOS is the start, but it's an incremental path. And in some cases, you're going to get larger products. You're going to get operations in controlled airspace, possibly closer to airports, may I even say at airports. The knowledge requirements, the training, you're going to begin to see are going to be closer and closer, I think, to traditional aviation and what we see in terms of our expectations there. So good question, good point. I think it's an evolution. We're trying some things differently while also respecting the system as it is.
Thank you. And it's a good transition to our second panel after the coffee break. But first of all, thank you very much to all my speakers and panelists. A big applause.